Imagine that. You are driving along a busy highway in your new pickup truck or SUV. The car costs tens of thousands of dollars. It is almost fresh. The mileage is minimal. You are sure that a time-tested engine is running under the hood. And suddenly, without a single warning, without lights or errors on the dashboard, the engine freezes. In 1 second, a 3-ton car turns into an uncontrollable piece of metal rushing along the highway. Is this an accident, failure, a rare defect, or is there a carefully hidden pattern that those who designed your engine knew about? Today we're going to tell a story that shocked America, the story of how the country's largest automaker, General Motors, deliberately allowed the production of hundreds of thousands of cars with engines doomed to early death. The story of how engineers sounded the alarm and managers in conference rooms made cold calculations. Which is more profitable, to admit the problem or wait until most customers' warranty is over? Strange messages started appearing on the mechanics forums. Lifters, camshafts, bearings. Everything failed much earlier than expected. Customers spent tens of thousands of dollars on repairs, and company representatives assured them that this was a rarity, the fault of the owner himself, improper oil and poor service. But as time went on, more and more facts formed a frightening picture. Internal documents at the disposal of lawyers show that GM had known about the defects for years. I knew that the cylinder shut-off system, thin oils, and savings on metal would sooner or later lead to disaster. But instead of fixing the problem, the company offered a solution that was actually a trap. The oil is thicker, the consumption is higher, the life is a little longer, but just enough for the engines to last until the end of the warranty, and then repairs, at the expense of the client. We are not talking about hundreds of cars, or even thousands. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of drivers who are driving around the roads today with a real-time bomb under the hood. These are the same Silverado, Tahoe, Suburban, Sierra cars that have been a symbol of the reliability of the American automotive industry for decades. Now everything looks different. Lawyers file lawsuits, courts stamp decisions, and the amount of claims has exceeded billions of dollars. General Motors has already agreed to pay $888 million, 0 cents. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. What was hidden on the sidelines of the corporation? Why did official services turn into a filter designed to prevent repairs? How did marketing campaigns continue to promise legendary reliability when they knew at headquarters that the engines would not even survive to the middle of their life cycle? Today you will hear what General Motors hoped to hide in technical bulletins and closed instructions. The story of how a guarantee turned into a weapon and customer trust turned into a consumable, and about why buying a car will never be the same again. The first warning signs about problems with General Motors engines did not appear at all in the news or in the company's official reports. They were born in the silence of garages, in messages on highly specialized forums, in short remarks by mechanics who tried to warn each other that something was wrong with GM engines. At first it looked like a statistical error. Rare breakdowns that could be attributed to a failed copy or poor maintenance, but every week there were more and more messages. The owners wrote that their pickups and SUVs with a mileage of only 15–20,000 miles suddenly began to emit a metallic clatter, lost power, or even got up on the highway without warning. The stories were too similar to ignore. The owner of a 2020 Chevrolet Tahoe in Arkansas complained that his engine jammed right during a family trip, even though he was at an authorized dealer. In Texas, a mechanic posted a video of a sawn camshaft from a new Silverado. The metal looked like it just hadn't been tempered. On one of the forums, the GMC Sierra driver said that the dealer refused to change the engine under warranty, citing incorrect oil, although the oil was filled exclusively recommended by the company. When hundreds of such stories accumulated, the puzzle began to be put together in the community of craftsmen. Lifters and valve mechanisms failed massively, and the active cylinder shut-off system, AFM, was created to save fuel, but in fact it caused an overload of individual components. The oil channels were clogged with tiny particles of chips, which the manufacturer did not even consider necessary to filter out. People who were far from technology saw only the result. Their cars, which cost $50,000, ended up on the sidelines. Inside the dealerships, the situation looked even more alarming. One former service department employee from Ohio later admitted to reporters that more than a dozen engines had been replaced in his workshop in 6 months, all with the same symptoms. We called it Russian roulette. No one knew which engine would die tomorrow, but the management forced us to write in the reports. The reason was improper operation. If the customer argued, we were offered to delay the time until the end of the warranty. Statistics were also accumulating. According to an internal source, the leaks of which later got into the court's materials, the number of warranty requests for Ecotec 3 family engines exceeded the planned targets by almost 3 times. At one of the meetings in Detroit, a slide with the headline, "Failure Rate Within Acceptable Financial Risk," was allegedly announced. In other words, the company considered massive engine failures acceptable as long as the cost of payments did not exceed the savings from using controversial solutions. But if the numbers could be interpreted in different ways, then human stories were more difficult to deny. In Illinois, a family was in an emergency when their Suburban stalled on a highway. In California, the owner of a new Silverado lost a transportation contract because his truck broke down after just 18,000 miles. In New York, a woman said she paid $12,000, 0 cents, to replace the engine on an SUV that was less than 3 years old. All these cases had one thing in common. Cars broke down suddenly and in the same way. The rumors grew, but GM officials remained silent. The press releases included phrases about a small percentage of requests and strict quality procedures. Meanwhile, there was already a whole series of technical bulletins within the company itself, which explicitly mentioned problems with oil channels, premature wear of cams, and improper heat treatment of parts. These documents were sent to dealers, but strictly under the heading, "For official use." This was how a shadowy information network was born, where ordinary drivers and repair workers discussed what the concern preferred to hide. For many, this was the first shock. The legendary brand, which had been associated with American reliability for decades, suddenly found itself at the center of suspicion. It was just the first call, the first round of scandal, but it was he who showed that the problem was not an accident, but a systemic catastrophe, the scale of which was just beginning to reveal itself. When the flood of complaints from owners of cars with GM engines became impossible to ignore, the company chose not the path of open recognition of the problem, but the tactic of silence and systemic concealment. Inside the corporation, it looked like a carefully constructed strategy to minimize information leaks, localize discontent, and at all costs prevent the public from seeing the scale of the disaster. The first step was the internal technical bulletins, which were sent to dealers under the strict label, "For official use." They provided standard answers for customers. The breakdowns were attributed to improper maintenance, poor fuel quality, or aggressive driving style. The real reasons? Defects in the oil channels, premature wear of the lifters, and poor quality heat treatment of the camshafts were carefully avoided even in the documents for the services. According to former GM employees, there was an unspoken policy within the company that any repairs that could be attributed to the customer's fault should be handled this way. If the owner could not produce all the service receipts, the warranty statement was automatically sent to the gray zone. In one of the internal letters, the head of the warranty department directly wrote, "Every case where there is a gap in the documentation should be interpreted in favor of the company. Even if the cause of the breakdown is obvious, the main thing is not to create a precedent for mass replacements." Such instructions transformed the guarantee for a protection for the client into a shield for the corporation. Moreover, according to several dealers from different states, they received special training on communication with dissatisfied customers. In these courses, managers were taught to find alternative versions of events. For example, if the engine is pounding, you can suggest to the client that the oil quality is low. If the engine is jammed, be reminded that towing heavy trailers could cause overheating. All this was accompanied by ready-made templates for responses in written complaints in order to maintain a uniform corporate tone. Meanwhile, completely different issues were being discussed at GM headquarters. The journalists found themselves in possession of minutes of meetings where top managers openly compared the projected cost of mass repairs with potential losses from lawsuits. At one of these meetings, held in 2019, a report called Mitigation Strategy for Lift Failures was allegedly presented. It stated bluntly, the probability of failure in the first 3 years is 12%, after the end of the warranty 37%. It is economically more profitable to wait until most cases occur during the post-warranty period. In fact, it was an admission that the company had deliberately built engine failure into its business model, shifting costs to customers. Communication isolation was a key element of the strategy. Any external inquiries from journalists or analysts received the same answers. We do not fix a systemic problem. The percentage of requests is within the normal range. The company is constantly working to improve product quality. But behind closed doors, there were rapid response teams that monitored forums, social networks, and even YouTube channels where videos about sudden engine failures appeared. According to insiders, bloggers were sometimes offered free repairs or a discount on a new car in exchange for removing a negative video. In one case, a well-known auto mechanic from Florida received a call from a dealer offering to replace his Tahoe with a new one, but on condition that he stop posting videos criticizing GM. Special attention was paid to delaying the moment of public recognition of the problem. There was even a joke inside the company: our best engineer is time. The longer it takes, the more cars will leave the warranty period, which means fewer financial obligations for the concern. This logic has become an unspoken policy at all levels. As a result, thousands of families face denial of repairs, and GM continued to post record sales reports and assure that customer trust remains the foundation of the brand. Thus, the cover-up was not a chaotic reaction to the crisis. It was a systematic, calculated strategy. Instead of solving the problem, GM deliberately built a wall of bureaucracy, misinformation, and pressure to shift the consequences onto the shoulders of its own customers. And it was this strategy, calculated on cold calculation and gaining time, that caused the scandal to barely break out and hit the corporation with such devastating force. When the pressure from owners, journalists, and independent mechanics became unbearable, GM was forced to demonstrate a step forward. But instead of recognizing the design flaws and carrying out large-scale technical improvements, the company chose a cheaper and, as time has shown, much more cynical path. The official decision was to change the specifications of the engine oil. Owners were required to abandon light synthetic mixtures, which were prescribed in the manuals and advertised as part of progressive efficiency, in favor of thicker and cheaper formulations. New oil filler caps appeared on the surfaces, on which the changed viscosity was engraved, and the firmware was updated in electronic catalogs so that the official data would not raise questions from future buyers. For the owners, everything looked simple: a new oil standard, supposedly proven to be effective in the laboratory. In fact, it was a substitution of concepts. Thicker oil could actually reduce the likelihood of oil starvation and prolong the life of components that were already wearing out abnormally fast. But this decision had hidden costs. Firstly, fuel efficiency dropped. Real measurements showed that consumption increased by 10–15%. Secondly, the engines began to run rougher on a cold start and in winter in the northern states. Owners complained that the car took longer to reach operating temperature. But the main blow was waiting for those who bought cars for the promised fuel economy. The sudden decrease in efficiency against the background of rising gasoline prices turned ownership into a much more expensive pleasure than it was planned at the time of purchase. Internal documents that surfaced in the courts confirmed that the main purpose of the oil change was not at all to protect customers. One of the memos explicitly stated, "The service life of the engine after switching to 5W40 exceeds the warranty limit by 14–18 months. In other words, the company was buying time so that the vast majority of failures occurred after the expiration of the factory warranty. For the customer, this meant tens of thousands of dollars to repair or replace the engine, but for GM it meant billions in savings. When the first complaints began to reach the courts, another side of the strategy entered the arena, using the guarantee system as a barrier. The scheme has been honed to perfection. The owners were forced to provide a complete package of documents confirming every oil change, every filter receipt, and every service visit. Any gap was automatically interpreted as a violation of the operating conditions. Whole groups of inspectors worked inside the service centers who had to find the slightest reason for refusal. Did the owner change the oil at an independent station? Refusal. Was the filter unoriginal even though it met the standards? Refusal. Even a slight excess of the maintenance interval could be the reason to shift thousands of repairs onto the shoulders of the client. The owner's stories multiplied. In Colorado, a farmer said that his Silverado with a mileage of only 62,000 miles stalled while transporting cargo. The engine was declared unrepairable and the warranty expired 2,000 miles ago. The final bill from the dealer is $14,800.00. In Oklahoma, a family who bought a GMC Yukon to travel with their children faced a complete $16,000.00 engine replacement a week after the end of the 5-year warranty period. In each case, clients faced not only a financial blow, but also a cold wall of corporate bureaucracy. GM did not limit itself to outright refusals. In some cases, the verification process was delayed for months. First, a diagnosis was prescribed, then a request for additional documents, then repeated examinations. The owners were left without cars, had to rent vehicles at their own expense, and many simply gave up without waiting for the result. According to the memoirs of one former service manager, the main goal was for the customer to get tired and refuse. The longer we waited, the less likely it was that he would go to court. Nevertheless, the wave of discontent was becoming too noticeable to be contained within the framework of behind-the-scenes procedures. Large law firms specializing in class action lawsuits sensed the moment and began collecting evidence. In a matter of months, several parallel cases have emerged across the country, bringing together thousands of owners. At one of the trials in Michigan, lawyers presented an array of data collected from forums and social networks. Hundreds of cases of premature engine failure, dozens of identical stories about warranty failures. The judge allowed the materials to be included in the case, and it was then that the public first saw the scale of the disaster. It turned out that the breakdowns were not isolated at all. Independent experts involved in assessing the situation have shown that the engine design itself has systemic weaknesses. Lifters wear out too quickly, oil does not have time to wash critical areas, and the metal of the parts often does not meet the stated standards. Moreover, switching to thick oil only masked the symptoms, but did not eliminate the root of the problem. The examinations revealed that even after the correction, the motors continued to collapse just a little later. GM tried to defend its position, arguing that any failures are within the statistical norm, and oil change is an innovative approach to prolonging life. But in the process, internal correspondence was opened, where managers directly discussed how to save on a massive recall and delay costs until the end of guarantees. To the jury, it looked like a cold calculation set against human lives and destinies. The market reacted instantly. Prices for used V8 models began to collapse in dealerships. Customers demanded huge discounts, and many refused to make deals at all. Insurance companies have revised tariffs, adding surcharges for cars with potentially dangerous engines. Some leasing companies have excluded certain GM models from their programs altogether, fearing massive rejections and subsequent lawsuits. For businesses, this meant billions in lost profits, but it was a much worse blow to their image. Fords, Frames, and Toyotas quickly caught on to the situation. The commercials featured phrases about real reliability, time-tested engines, and a no-tricks guarantee. At first glance, these were common marketing cliches, but every viewer understood who this blow was aimed at. Moreover, competitors have started offering extended warranties and free service packages, playing on customer concerns. Fleet customers, transportation companies, construction companies, and delivery services began to abandon GM purchases en masse, switching to Ford and Ram. For the concern, this was a blow to the most profitable segment, because it was large purchases that brought stable revenues for decades. Ultimately, it was the combination of three factors: a fictitious oil solution, an aggressive warranty denial system, and the subsequent avalanche of legal pressure that turned the crisis into a disaster. This was not just a technical defect, but a strategic mistake, based on the belief that the corporation was able to control information and pass the consequences on to customers. But in the era of social media and independent expertise, this approach proved fatal. Where GM tried to save millions, The company lost billions and, worse, customer trust, which has been recovering for decades. The outcome of the whole story of GM's defective engines turned out to be much more serious than just lawsuits and damages. The company's reputation, which had been built on the image of American reliability for decades, collapsed in just a few years. For many buyers, the symbols of power and durability, Silverado pickups and Tahoe or Suburban SUVs, have ceased to be associated with confident driving and family stability. Now they were cars with the stigma of hidden risk, a potential disaster under the hood. Even those who had never personally encountered the problem began to wonder, is it worth trusting a manufacturer who deliberately hid the truth? In the secondary market, cars with problematic engines fell in price faster than others. The owners said that when they tried to exchange a car in a trade-in, they were offered amounts 30–40% lower than expected. Dealers made excuses. The engine is too risky, the demand is small. People felt cheated twice. First when the engine failed or threatened to do so, and the second time when even a serviceable car turned out to be useless to anyone. This created a wave of irritation that already went far beyond the technical topic. It was about trust in the brand and in the very idea of the American car industry.